On December 25th, we commemorate the nativity of Jesus Christ, the Son of God and second person of the Holy Trinity, who entered into history becoming incarnate among men and beginning the work of redemption to free mankind from the stain of original sin, inflicted upon us by Adam in the Garden of Eden. Every year, as the Christmas season approaches, Christians in the West are exposed to anticipatory music, secular marketing, seasonal decorations, and, very likely, references to the idea that the choice of December 25th to celebrate Jesus is primarily about its association with paganism, rather than any actual intrinsic connection to Christianity itself. How true are these claims? Where did they come from and who made them? And what consequences do these claims have, if they are true, on the celebration of Christmas for us today? When talking about the debate over the date of Christmas, there are two main parties within modern historical scholarship. The first group contains the scholars which subscribe to the history of religions theory for December 25th, and the second group which subscribe to the calculations theory for December 25th. The history of religions theory, which is a theory advocating for a principally pagan explanation of the nativity date, has enjoyed the greatest clout in the modern era. The calculations theory, on the other hand, proposes that December 25th was calculated based on numerical symbolism popular in early Christian circles, and some variation on this theory is generally more popular among Christians today. The modern scholars we might call the standard bearers for each movement are Hermann Usener in the history of religions camp and Thomas Talley in the calculations camp. But both of these men defend ideas that are older than either of them, and which have been developed in significant ways since then. Much of this debate revolves around one very important year, 336 AD. 336 is the date in which the chronograph was compiled, a document which features the first uncontested reference to December 25th as the birth of Jesus Christ. However, this same document also lists the celebration of Sol Invictus, the sun god, as December 25th, and it is from this guilt by association that we get the essence of the history of religion's view. Oxford history professor Philip Nothaft summarized the basic tenets of the history of religion's argument in the work of Hermann Usener, noting, "Christianity was the heritage of a syncretistic cult. In 274, the Emperor Aurelian allegedly elevated the Oriental sun god Sol Invictus to the supreme deity of the Roman Empire, and established his cult on December 25th. Threatened by the persistent popularity of these rituals among newly baptized Christians, the early church was moved to incorporate traces of the cult into its own liturgy, and thus reinterpreted the annual birth of the sun at the winter solstice as the birth festival of Christmas. Now, it's probably fair to say that when presented with an argument like that, the average person today would probably characterize Hermann Usener's words as hostile to Christianity. So you may find it ironic that much of what the history of religions theory in general is drawing on doesn't come from atheist or agnostic scholarly work, but rather Christianity, specifically Christianity during the Reformation. The Feast of the Nativity of Christ was established throughout the Roman Empire by the late 300s, and was of course still widely celebrated in 1500s Europe. But as the Protestant Reformation began to take hold in the West, allies of the Protestant Reformation began to see their collective liturgical traditions in a new, more hostile light. As Nothaft explains, this skepticism inspired some Protestant, and in particular Calvinist scholars, to attack the historical basis of feasts like Christmas. Take, for example, an influential 1500s scholar like Matthias Baraldus. Baraldus is thinking of Christianity in a restorationist framework. For him and others like him, the authentic, pure Christianity has been corrupted with the errors of the Catholic Church, and as scholars they were merely attempting to correct unscriptural mistakes. And there are good reasons for some of the criticisms that Baraldus raised. Take, for example, a popular chronological model then attributed to St. John Chrysostom. Christians could know the date of December 25th as Jesus' birth by first assuming that Zechariah was high priest and in the Jerusalem temple on the Day of Atonement when the angel Gabriel appeared to him. Since John the Baptist was conceived shortly after this account, and Jesus was born 6 months after John the Baptist, Jesus was born 9 months later on December 25th. The problem, of course, is that although works such as the Proto-Evangelium of James allude to Zechariah as high priest, these contradict the actual biblical text of Luke, which says that Zechariah is part of the Abijah priestly division, or in other words, not the high priest, and not in the temple on the Day of Atonement. Following the work of Baraldus, other 1500 scholars like Joseph Scaliger further discredited the popular conception of December 25th and noted that, contrary to popular belief, the Church Fathers did not have a consistent account of the date of Jesus' birth. In both cases, Scaliger and Baraldus are interested in creating a new chronology of Jesus' birth based on superior Protestant thinking, and on discrediting the Catholic consensus view. But out of this milieu also arrived more radical thinkers like Rudolf Ospinian, who in his Festa Christianorum goes beyond chronological dating arguments and argues for pre-Christian roots to the Catholic celebration of Christmas. Ospinian attempts to directly connect old pagan ideas like the Lord of Misrule, an English custom of master and servant swapping, and the Roman Saturnalia on December 17th to the 23rd to Christmas celebrations, and to directly voice that now infamous idea taken up by history of religion circles that one or more pagan customs are the true beginnings of the Christmas date, and not any early Christian belief as such. And again, at this time, none of this is about discrediting Christianity or Jesus as such, but just about discrediting Catholicism in particular. As Puritanism took hold in Britain, a pamphleteer named William Prine strongly denounced Christmas as a Catholic reintroduction of pagan rites into an otherwise pure Christianity, and eventually Parliament bowed to Puritan sympathies and outlawed Christmas entirely in 1647. While the history of religions theory today in no way belongs exclusively to Protestantism, it's important to keep in mind its concerns about pagan influence because it helps inform the fears and responses that generated the initial scholarship on this topic. Before switching gears to talk about the calculations theory for December 25th, I want to dive into the Catholic perspective on pagan influence in Christian practice and how our perspective would differ from a Puritan one. On the one hand, there is a real problem which early Christianity has always had to reconcile and definitely did struggle with in the early church, which is syncretism, and even syncretism having to do with the sun god in particular, as Hermann Usener alluded to. In the mid-400s, less than 100 years after the Feast of Christmas had become well established throughout the empire, Pope Leo the Great described this exact problem where certain Christians were holding on to old pagan practices, noting that even some Christians, before entering the Blessed Apostle Peter's Basilica, which is dedicated to the one living and true God, turn round and bow themselves towards the rising sun, and with bent neck do homage to its brilliant orb. We are full of grief and vexation that this should happen. If you want a modern and even more egregious example of syncretist confusion, look no further than the Mexican cult of Santa Muerta, where Christians attached to old superstition worship a personification of a natural force, in this case death, represented in a similar fashion to the Blessed Mother. Like the old sun worship, the Catholic Church has discouraged this practice in favor of true veneration of God and the saints. But where does the Church actually draw the line here? After all, if you were to take a visit to modern-day Rome, you'll have the opportunity to visit Catholic churches that were clearly once pagan temples, such as the circular Pantheon, which was originally built to honor the Olympians. What makes worshiping the one God in a place that was once used to worship false gods okay, but not venerating the sun or building shrines to death? When dealing with pagan practices, the Church is concerned about two things: avoiding the sin of scandal and avoiding the sin of idolatry. The sin of scandal is when something which is not inherently sinful, but which appears sinful, is done without regard for the weaker faith of those around you, while idolatry is the sin of treating something as divine which is not divine. In the previous example, Pope Leo preaches against this sin of scandal when he says, "Some of them do perhaps worship the creator of that fair light rather than the light itself, which is his creature, yet we must abstain even from the appearance of this observance." In the case of the wrong object, the sin of idolatry, Leo says, "The honor due to God alone must not be mixed up with those men's rights who serve their fellow creatures. For the divine scripture says, 'You shall worship the Lord your God, in him only shall you serve.'" However, if both the sins of scandal and the sins of idolatry can be avoided, the Church accepts and may even encourage the use of what once served pagan gods to serve the one true God. This is because all that God has made is good, and evil is nothing but a misshapen good, which can often be bent back into shape. This is of course a very old principle that goes all the way back to the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt during the Exodus. As another Pope Leo XIII explains, the Hebrews were commanded to take with them the gold and silver vessels and precious robes of the Egyptians, that by a change of use the things might be dedicated to the service of the true God, which had formerly been the instruments of ignoble and superstitious rites. And from this principle we directly explain the use of the Pantheon in Rome. For as Pope Gregory the Great says in the 500s, the temples of the idols should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols in them. If the shrines are well built, it is essential that they be converted from the worship of devils to the service of the true God. Thus Gregory invites those who are still attached to paganism into their new life in Christ through the external things that are familiar to them, while using those externals to house a new and better reality. And this framing helps us understand the foolishness at the heart of Puritanism that they would ban Christmas. As a restorationist movement, the Reformation has an inherently narrow view of history that is cutting itself off from the collective wisdom of its forefathers in favor of a stunted theology based on misguided fundamentalism. For if we seek to tear away every practice which was once used by pagans, we will soon find that we are tearing away not only Catholicism, but also the commands of God within the Old Testament itself. Now, from everything just said, you might be inclined to agree with Usener in the history of religions theory. After all, as I've just argued, the Church has a long tradition of repurposing what was once used for evil and using it for good. And even if you think Usener is wrong about the Church's motivations or how he frames the issue, he could be right that the Church adopted December 25th to supplant a pagan sun cult, and it wouldn't really impact anything having to do with how we think about Christ and his birth. And there's a lot of the groundwork for that already just from looking at the scriptures. The prophecy about the Messiah in the book of Malachi describes Jesus as the Son, S-U-N, of righteousness, and Jesus characterizes himself with light imagery in verses like John 8:12. So if the history of religions theory were definitively proven by some scholar, one could just rationalize the choice of December 25th as the Church emphasizing things already found within the Bible, but for a new Greco-Roman context. But is the history of religions theory about December 25th actually true? And does the evidence really point in that direction? It's time to switch gears and talk about the calculations theory. In essence, the calculations theory of Christmas posits that Jesus' nativity was selected based on numerical and religious symbolism. As we've already seen, whether among Protestants or the early Church, there's long been a fascination with calculating the date of the nativity based on scriptural starting data. But as we've also seen, there have been a variety of different calculations which contradict one another or rely on bad assumptions, as with St. John Chrysostom. But Chrysostom isn't our primary target in this debate anyway, as he is after our contested date in the history of religions debate, 336 AD. What we need to know is what kinds of calculations were made before 336 that might explain a date of December 25th, rather than simply explain it after the fact, as with Chrysostom. And for that purpose, some of our most important works are Julius Africanus's Chronographiae and the Canon, Chronicon, and Commentary on Daniel, which are attributed to Hippolytus. And again, for clarity, none of these very similarly named documents are the same thing as the chronograph from 336. What do these sources tell us, and what does the calculations theory assume about them in order for them to be useful resources in this debate? Calculations theorists have demonstrated the Jewish concept of living for a fullness of years, where an important figure would end their life on the same day they began it. While the gospel accounts are relatively sparse on details about Jesus' birth, they tell us a lot of things about when Jesus died, meaning that if we were to assume he died on the same day he was conceived, we can use that information to calculate Jesus' birth, or at least to determine if an early Christian could have selected December 25th based on their available information. And because of the gospel accounts, we know that Jesus' ministry started on the 15th year of Tiberius' reign, and that he died on the week of Passover in springtime, on the day of a full moon, and on a Friday, giving us a relatively small window in which to search for the date of Jesus' death based on lunar calculations. In addition to these dating arguments, early Christians were also interested in how the natural world complemented Jesus' birth, and in possible typological significance of Christ's life, as it related to the Jewish calendar. Since Jesus is the light of the world, it makes sense to talk about Jesus coming into the world when the day was darkest. Using lunar records, the Jewish calendar, and the equinox framing, the work of these early Christians comes into clearer picture. In our earliest document, Julius Africanus's Chronographiae, Africanus argues that Jesus' resurrection and his conception was on March 25th, which had complementary symbolic implications because March's spring equinox divided day and night like God divided the day and night in the book of Genesis. This feeds into the prophecy of Malachi mentioned before, since the Messiah is identified as the sun, and March 25th is the date traditionally understood as when God created the sun and moon. Although we only have fragments of Africanus' work, and Africanus doesn't come right out and specify the date of Jesus' nativity in this formula, it's not much of a leap to add 9 months to March 25th and get December 25th. Africanus also wasn't alone in placing special importance on the date of March 25th, although some Christians shifted the timeline somewhat. Hippolytus's Canon and Chronicon also reference this date, but rather than the resurrection they assign the 25th as the Friday of Jesus' death a few days earlier, an opinion shared by Tertullian. Hippolytus also isn't as concerned with the symmetry of Jesus' death and life as Africanus, and calculates Jesus' genesis as April 2nd, but this still feeds into Jewish symbolism since a conception on April 2nd would have fallen during a Passover week. And another piece of evidence is the commentary on Daniel, which directly says that December 25th is the date of the Nativity. When talking about early Christian sources, I should also briefly mention Clement of Alexandria's Stromatis. Clement's work references a number of different dates, other than December 25th, that he has heard reportedly featured celebrations associated with Jesus' birth. Because Clement does not mention December 25th, it served to bolster Protestant criticisms of the Nativity in the 1500s. But Clement is interesting for a positive exploration of Christmas dating as well, because one of the dates he lists is January 6th. It's a small reference, but it's notable because January 6th is the date we now connect to the Feast of the Three Kings on the Epiphany, and it shows the very early heritage of such feasts in Christianity. Having given the basic outlines of both major theories of how December 25th was established, let's talk about some important criticisms. One thing that the history of religion scholars have suggested is that the equinox explanation for placing the Nativity could be used to support their own view, since if in fact December 25th was chosen to overlap a sun festival, December 25th corresponds to the Roman dating of the equinox. Another obstacle for the calculations theory during the 20th century came from the use of Hippolytus as a plausible defense of the classical nativity dating. Although there were various authorship debates surrounding the Hippolytus texts, and some question of whether one or more were written by different authors, one really problematic reason these texts were criticized was the history of religion scholars' doubt that the word origins in the original texts refers to Jesus' conception, meaning that an origin happening on March 25th or April 2nd could be referring to Jesus' birth instead, which obviously ruins the whole timeline of the calculations theory. Additionally, there was doubt cast upon the authenticity of the December 25th date found in Hippolytus' commentary on Daniel. This is because while 5 of the 6 preserved copies mention December 25th, one mentions April 2nd, which it could be argued was the original, while the other 5 would be later revisions. Though of course, April 2nd in the 6th copy could also refer to Jesus' conception and doesn't necessarily need to contradict any other texts. These and other textual issues plagued the debates between these two camps, but without a clear proof text, the history of religion scholars and the calculations theory scholars were both left unsatisfied during the 1900s, though with a general bias more in the history of religion's direction. As Notre Dame scholar Paul F. Bradshaw noted, this is where the debate between the supporters of the two rival hypotheses stood until very recently, with neither side able to produce convincing arguments to sway the other. Germanic and Romance language scholars on the whole have tended to lean in the direction of the history of religion's theory, while Anglo-Saxon writers display somewhat more sympathy for the calculation hypothesis. But because historical scholarship, unlike history, is ever evolving, the 21st century has pushed the scales back towards the calculations theory in important ways due to the work of two scholars, Stephen Hidgmans in 2003 and T.C. Schmidt in 2015. Schmidt has helped give a sure foundation to the reading of the word Genesis in early Christian texts as referring to Jesus' conception by showing parallel usages of the word in other contemporaries of Hippolytus. Hidgmans, meanwhile, has shown that the alleged Sol Invictus connection to Jesus is rather tenuous, both because it relies on 1800s confirmation bias, and because there is clear evidence that the sun cult pre-existed any supposed new establishment of that cult by Aurelian in the 200s, which was an important part of the history of religion's hypothesis. Additionally, December 25th wasn't a classical date for the celebration of the sun god, with August 8th or 9th, August 28th, October 19th or 22nd, and December 11th being more common astronomical festivals. In fact, the chronograph is the first certifiable reference we have, not only for December 25th as Jesus' birth, but also for the Sol Invictus festival, coupled with the fact that the chronograph never actually says the words Sol Invictus, but just Invictus, which has a number of non-sun god meanings, and the whole thing looks even more suspect. Hidgmans also points out that rather than following Usener's view of assuming the date for the Nativity of Jesus was established to paper over a pagan festival, one could do the reverse and argue that a pagan influence was attempting to push back against a Christian celebration with a traditional Roman one. According to Bradshaw, the festival of Sol Invictus is the cornerstone of the history of religion's movement, and this means that significant work which undermines it undermines the credibility of the whole theory. So where does all of this leave us when thinking about the choice of December 25th to celebrate the birth of Christ? Ultimately, it depends on who you ask, and there are a lot of pious Christians who hold differing views. While it may take some time for popular culture to let go of its inherited Calvinist and Puritan reading of early Christian liturgical practice, there is plenty of scholarship today ranging from cautious optimism to full-blown endorsement of calculations thinking. Oxford's Philip Nothaft argues that it will no longer do to simply juxtapose history of religions theory and calculations theory as sharp alternatives. Indeed, one of the most encouraging trends in recent research on Christmas's history is its critical stance towards sweeping narratives, and a readiness to consider explanations that are more multifaceted. On the other hand, Muhlenberg College's William Teague was wholly convinced by the newer evidence, stating, December 25th as the date of the Christ's birth appears to owe nothing whatsoever to pagan influence upon the practice of the Church during or after Constantine's time. It is wholly unlikely to have been the actual date of Christ's birth, but it arose entirely from the efforts of early Latin Christians to determine the historical date of Christ's death. Meanwhile, the Augustine Institute's Michael Barber points out that, although the Church did not likely choose December 25th simply to counter the worship of Sol Invictus, the best evidence suggests that the pieces for the December 25th birth date of Jesus were already in place by the end of the 200s, long before there is evidence that a feast honoring a pagan sun god took place on this date. Still, by choosing December 25th, the Church was selecting a date that could be very easily misconstrued. Many Christians today often bemoan the war on Christmas. The truth is, the Church fired the first volley. By celebrating Christ's birth on December 25th, Christians proclaimed that the world's story is ultimately summed up in Christ. There's a lot of extra details that did not make it into the final version of this script, so I encourage you to read the resources in the description to get a more thorough picture of the debate about December 25th. Merry Christmas to you, and Happy New Year.